But now I have much pleasure in introducing today's guest speaker, Richard Mack, who, after a career in education, moved to Longford for a quiet retirement. So during that time, he's been researching the life of his aunt, physiotherapist Margaret Mack. Many of you would have known her, or at least heard of her. So now he's ready to share his findings with us. And welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you to the Launceston Historical Society for inviting me along today. Firstly, an apology to Margaret. She was a very private and humble person, and she'd be dismayed to think that her life was being paraded in front of such a large group, many of whom would no doubt be complete strangers. Sorry, Margaret, but I think your community deserves to know your story. I'd like to join with President Marion in acknowledging that we're meeting on the country of the clans of the Stony Creek Nation, who, as the traditional owners, have been custodians of the land for many thousands of years and lived in harmony with nature. Margaret's ancestors were not descended from the Indigenous peoples of Australia. They were more recent arrivals, boat people from the British Isles in the late 18th and 19th centuries. On her father's side, Macks and Austins, Margaret's ancestors included the convict who began Hobart's first ferry service, James Austin, and pioneers of Victoria's Western District, Thomas Austin and Joseph Gardner Mack. Thomas is remembered, somewhat unfairly, as a man who introduced rabbits to the country, while his wife was a benefactor behind Melbourne's Austin Hospital and the Austin Homes in Geelong. On her mother's side, McCallum, Henderson, Balmain, Dawson, Rose. There were First Fleeters, Surgeon William Balmain and his common law convict wife Margaret Dawson, and there were members of Melbourne's commercial society, the McCallums, who made their fortune importing from India. Margaret was the fifth of 6 children of Gardner Mack and Margaret, née McCallum, always known as Daisy. Her eldest brother Joe joined the Australian Navy and was killed in the Great War. Kathleen put aside a career as a masseur and promising writer to marry and become a suburban housewife and mother's, one of the countless unfulfilled talents. Her middle brother, Ian, became a patrol officer in the Australian Territory of New Guinea. After almost a decade of excellent service, he was murdered by villagers when seeking an escaped criminal. Carbon copies of all his patrol reports were given to Margaret, who in turn passed them on to me. They've been transcribed and now reside in the School of Pacific Studies at the ANU in Canberra. Her youngest brother, Don, my father, spent 30 years as an engineer in the railways of the British colony of Malaya. This experience was interrupted by the war, in which he escaped the Japanese invasion, but only after staying behind to destroy infrastructure and rolling stock in order to slow the advance as best he could. His wife and son were repatriated back to Australia on the last ship out of Singapore, whereupon Dorothy found she was pregnant again. My timing was always terrible. Margaret's parents were mismatched. He was from a pastoral family in rural Victoria, she from a middle-class commercial family in Melbourne. They were brought together by Gardner's sister Nellie, who was sent to school in town, where she met and befriended Daisy. No doubt the diminutive Daisy was swept off her feet by the tall, handsome young man in the saddle, while he succumbed to her sophisticated urban claims. But after 10 years of marriage and following her husband from one failed farming venture to another, Daisy had had enough. She packed up her 4 children and sailed to England. The family stayed at Poole in Dorset, near to a sister who had married and returned to the old country. However, there must have been a reconciliation, for the family, minus Joe, who had entered the Naval Academy, returned to Australia. And here in Geelong, on the 25th of January 1915, a girl was born. Named Margaret for her mother, Annette for her mother's favourite sister, and Rose for a family belief that there was a fortune waiting in Chancery for anyone who could prove a supposed descent from a previous royal indiscretion. Margaret would later say that her birthday was celebrated with a national holiday, but that with true government incompetence, they got the date wrong and celebrated on the 26th instead. The holiday was, of course, the anniversary of the arrival of the first British convicts and their jailers to Sydney Cove in 1788, which, unknown to Margaret until late in life, included 2 of her ancestors. Margaret was only 4 months old when tragedy struck the family. HMS Defence was sunk with the loss of all hands, including brother Joe, at the Battle of Jutland in May 1916. I was privileged to attend the last post ceremony held in his honour on the centenary of that disaster. 2 years later, another daughter arrived, named Josephine, after the brother who was killed in action. But the rapprochement failed to last. Over the next 2 decades, Daisy and the 2 young girls were to be found in rented accommodation, firstly in Geelong and then in the inner southern Melbourne suburbs, probably financed by Daisy's influential McCallum relatives. Perhaps they could be described as belonging to the genteel poor. The family's support enabled the girls to attend the Geelong Girls' Grammar School, the Hermitage, and the Melbourne Girls' Grammar School, Merton Hall. A McCallum uncle was a member of the Melbourne Cricket Club and was able to give the family tickets to the Test cricket and tennis at Kooyong. Both the girls contracted polio in 1928. While Josephine was quite severely afflicted, Margaret was considered only a mild, non-paralytic case, not much worse than flu. She believed this gave her immunity in later life when she was involved with the disease. Josephine's polio had been treated for several years by Dr. Jean McNamara, and in 1991, Margaret recalled, "I can see her coming now into the house and saying to Mother, 'What's Margaret going to do when she grows up?' And Mother said, 'Oh, she's only 13 now. She has no idea what she wants to do.' And the doctor said, 'Well, why doesn't she do massage and work for me?' From that moment on, it was decided that I would become a masseuse." Dame Jean McNamara was a resident doctor at the Children's Hospital and consultant to the Poliomyelitis Committee of Victoria between 1925 and 1931. She was knighted for her services to the welfare of children in 1935. So in 1930, at the age of 15, Margaret joined the Junior League of Nations. This was an early demonstration of a concern to bring about a better world through helping people, a concern which shaped her future life. In 1933, aged 18, Margaret made her debut, along with 2 of her McCallum cousins, a rite of passage expected of young girls of good breeding. And at about the same time, she had her photo taken at one of Melbourne's leading photographic studios. In the same year, another tragedy struck the family when Ian was murdered in the line of duty as a patrol officer in New Guinea. Margaret had always looked up to her dashing older brother. He had sought a life of adventure and service among the people of this Australian territory, and she felt his loss keenly. Perhaps his example also helped to inspire her commitment to aid others. Having completed her schooling, Margaret was not old enough for university and spent a year at the Working Men's College, now RMIT University, studying physics and chemistry. She then undertook the 2-year massage course in the medical school at the University of Melbourne in a class of 8, all women, and in May 1936 was awarded the Diploma in Massage, Medical Electricity and Medical Gymnastics by the Australasian Massage Association. Muscle re-education was added to the course as a corrective treatment for infantile paralysis, poliomyelitis. She then worked part-time at the Alfred and Children's Hospitals and at a private school for mentally and physically disabled children. As early as 1936, Margaret's passion for bridge was evident. Her attendance was noted at a bridge party to raise funds for Prince Henry's Hospital. At the end of 1936, Dr. McNamara told her that a physiotherapist was needed in Launceston to take charge of the few polios that were left from the 1934 epidemic and suggested Margaret apply. So, in January 1937, Margaret, her mother Daisy and sister Josephine arrived on the Taroona, bringing her car with her. This was a Singer, which she had named Melba. Boom, boom. She started work immediately at Launceston General Hospital. At first, Margaret and her family boarded a Highfield house in Wellman Street, just a short walk from LGH. But they soon moved to a flat in Bifron House in High Street, which is still there, of course. The family soon settled in, and apart from the war years, she was to reside in Launceston for the rest of her long life. Margaret's work began in the Children's Hospital, opened in 1909 and located on the southeast corner of Charles and Franklin Street. At first, Margaret was the only physio. Soon after her arrival, Margaret was interviewed by the Launceston Examiner during a few moments while a patient was having medical electrical equipment. Margaret scotched the idea that to do massage work, it was necessary to have a certain amount of electricity in the fingers, but stated that fingers naturally became more subtle from the massage work. She explained that the conditions treated included fractures, circulatory disturbances, stiff joints and arthritis. Muscle re-education was used for polio and nerve injuries, and medical gymnasium for twisted spines. The reporter noted that Margaret was a possessor of a happy disposition and had a cheery word for her departing patient and welcomed the new patient with a smile that immediately set the patient smiling too. In November 1937, a poliomyelitis epidemic hit Tasmania, especially in the north of the state. At the height of the epidemic, Launceston was quarantined and schools closed. After a couple of months, there were 500 polio patients. Margaret, aged 23, was in charge of 9 staff as well as a number of volunteers. They had 12 respirators, iron lungs, for the badly paralysed patients, but there were still a number of deaths, and it was so crowded with 119 patients one weekend that even the blanket racks were used as beds. As she later said, we were just flying blind. With no antibiotics and no anti-inflammatory treatment for arthritic conditions, Margaret and her team had to do the best they could with heat massage and exercise. As one of her patients, and that patient's muscle chart. Now, you can't read the details, I'm sure, but there's a contrast between her left leg and her right leg. Her left leg, all the figures are zeros or ones, the right leg 4 and 5. She was obviously severely disabled in the left leg particularly. The polio patients were transferred from the Children's Hospital to the Infectious Diseases Hospital. This had been opened in 1921 on the corner of Howick and Mulgrave Streets, the site of the present Allambie Centre. It previously treated conditions like scarlet fever, typhoid fever and tuberculosis, and now treated polio patients. The government provided a fortnightly train service from Devonport, so parents from the northwest could visit their children. At these visits, the physios would explain the treatments being applied and discuss the progress made. And in 1938, an aftercare pavilion was built beside the IDH by J and T Gunn in a remarkable 6 weeks. This was to house the patients who no longer needed hospitalisation but required ongoing treatment, perhaps for several years. Here, Margaret worked with the young polio patients. She would see them every day to assess the degree of strength that was left in muscles, measure them for splints, and work on gradually re-educating the muscles through gentle exercise. While some patients recovered quickly, for many it was slow and painstaking work. The daughter of one of her patients recalls that her mother spent hours outside in her bed on the veranda and always blamed that for her excess of freckles. In 1938, the Crippled Children's Society was formed and the St Giles Home and School was established on a former orchard at Waterworth House in Amy Road, Newstead. Margaret was sent from LGH to St Giles to work with patients there. One patient stated that we dreaded having to go to the physio, the torture chamber. Behind their backs, the physios were known as physio-terrorists. When war broke out, it was taken for granted that Margaret would join up. She later said that it was just a job of work to go and do. I can't say I felt any patriotism. She applied to join up, and went to Melbourne for orientation, but it took several months for confirmation, during which Margaret kept working at the aftercare hospital at LGH and at St Giles. The Army was not sure what to do with the physiotherapists. They started them as warrant officers and they lived with the nursing sisters under the discipline of the matron of the hospital. Later, they were made full lieutenants and captains and lost their original blue uniforms, which were replaced with less than glamorous khaki. Margaret farewelled her colleagues and patients, bought a diary, and noted her last day at work. She had a studio photograph taken, and her departure was noted by the examiner. Even the patients travelled down to the wharf to farewell her. Of the 10 physios selected, 6 were from Victoria, 3 from South Australia, and Margaret was the only Tasmanian. At 24, she was the second youngest. While their names are mostly forgotten now, some of them became prominent in their field, and all should be acknowledged for the part they played in the war effort. So I've just listed their names there. There was more publicity when Margaret arrived in Melbourne and farewells to be made to her family and Victorian friends. Then it was all aboard at Station Pier for the journey to an unknown destination. Can anyone pick out Margaret there? There she is. The little dumpy one. The Physios left Melbourne on the 15th of April 1940 on a troop ship, the converted passenger liner Strathaired. You can see the difference there. They travelled along with the troops of the 17th Brigade, 6th Division AIF. And who suggested we should have physios on board? Sore backs, nothing. They didn't know where they were going, but called in at Perth and Colombo. Here, Margaret was ashamed of being Australian, as the behaviour of the drunken soldiers disgusted her. They passed Aden, which was very barren, reminding Margaret of Queenstown. Eventually, they disembarked in the Suez Canal at Kantara and travelled by train to Gaza. The voyage was very relaxing in the luxury liner, with excellent food, deck chairs to relax in, deck and indoor games, and movies to provide entertainment. Margaret later recalled that, really, it was a luxury cruise at the government's expense. Margaret was to spend almost 2 years in service overseas, firstly in Gaza and Nazareth in the Middle East, and then at Kantara on the banks of the Suez Canal in Egypt. Doubtless, it was the experience of visiting the holy cities of the Middle East and the ancient Egyptian civilisations that gave her the thirst for travel which she was able to indulge in later years. Soon after her arrival, Margaret described the living accommodation in a letter home. The tent floors are very dusty, so we pour buckets of water over them and then stamp it down hard. I hope to buy some rush mats this morning. Our mess is a wooden building with a concrete floor. At the time of arrival, there was no war in the Middle East or North Africa, so there was very little work for the physios to do, other than tend to those who had suffered motorcycle accidents, sore backs, or general injuries. The British Army had 2 hospitals in Nazareth and Jerusalem, and some of the physios were loaned to them. Margaret spent 6 weeks at each, under British discipline which she found irksome. The colonel in charge insisted that beds had to be perfect. They couldn't be ruffled, even after Margaret had treated a patient. In a 2003 interview, Margaret was asked about the equipment she used overseas on the wounded soldiers. She replied that, "We didn't have any equipment really. A pair of hands is the most important equipment. A pair of hands, a tongue, and a pair of ears. A pair of ears to listen to people's complaints, and a tongue to encourage them onwards, and your hands to work on them." She felt that if you could get them talking, that's a great help to them. Or you talk to them and reassure them. Make them feel that they will recover, no matter what is wrong with them, and that they will go on recovering and be useful citizens. As well as gunshot and mortar wounds, the physios worked on men who had suffered concussion shocks from bomb blasts or car and motorbike accidents. There were even a few self-inflicted wounds, accidental or deliberate. But in 2003, she reminisced that the war injuries were nothing after a polio epidemic. With work finishing around midday and with a sleep after lunch, there was plenty of time for relaxation. Margaret's diaries and letters tell us nothing about her duties and everything about her social life. Typically, worked in the morning and collected a few new patients. In the afternoon, some British nurses and I went to Haifa. We spent most of the afternoon having our hair done at the American Beauty Salon. Her writings are filled with drinks in the mess, shopping trips in Haifa, sightseeing exploits such as exploring the holy sites at Nazareth or picnics on Mount Tabor. Rarely is the reader reminded that there's a war raging somewhere beyond the hospital compound. Margaret loved swimming and took every opportunity to relieve the heat by hitting the water, be it the Mediterranean at Gaza, the Dead Sea, or the Suez Canal at Kantara. She described swimming in the Dead Sea in June 1940, and I see that's one of the slides that was presented earlier. I've got the original of that at home. I've no idea how a copy got to the university in Sydney. So, well done. We had come back from Jericho, again onto the Dead Sea Road. There's a cafe with dressing sheds and showers right on the lake. As it was 130 degrees Fahrenheit, we sat down and had a drink and cooled off. Then we went for our swim. The water at the edge was quite hot. You really and truly can't sink. It's so funny because you haven't proper control over your legs. They always come up. We were careful not to swallow or get any water in our eyes. I just put some on my tongue. It was horrid. We had a good shower to remove the salt, and then we came home after dressing. Whenever she had some days off, she would take herself off to visiting neighbouring towns and historic sites, and her letters home would describe these in detail. Clearly, this is where her love of travel was born and continued throughout her life. Occasionally, her diary and letters remind the reader that there is a war somewhere nearby. In October 1940, she tells us that after lunch we had a gas demonstration, decontamination and gas bombs and a few other odd things. Suddenly, unbeknownst, they lit some tear gas and we had to don our respirators hurriedly. This show took almost an hour, and immediately it was over, we had to come and stand for another hour doing squad drill. This sometimes produced odd contrasts. In August 1940, Margaret and some colleagues were in Haifa, where we had a lovely time in town, went up the mountain and saw a view which was glorious. The bay was so blue and the mountains on the far side so clear, and the smoke from the previous air raid just completed the picture. And we were told that the tomb of the sacred bulls in Saqqara in Egypt would make a grand air raid shelter. But the war never seemed very close. And it would have been easy to assume that life was nearly normal. After about 9 months at Gaza and Nazareth, the camp was moved to Kantara on the banks of the Suez Canal in Egypt, as fighting had started along the North African coast and casualties were coming in from Greece and Crete. Margaret commented on the contrast, the heat, the sand, the dust storms, in contrast to the fertile Levant coast they had left. The personnel had very little to do with local citizens, other than shopkeepers or taxi drivers. There were a number of locals working in the camps as cleaners, waiters, etc. 2 waiters caught Margaret's attention. One was very dark, and the Australian soldiers nicknamed him Midnight. The other was not quite so dark, so he was called 10 to 12. Life continued to have its definite routine. Work in the morning, chores or relaxation in the afternoon. This included tennis, swimming, tapestry, letter writing or washing, and perhaps the open-air cinema or a dance in the evening or a Christmas celebration. As a woman, Margaret was drafted into the mess as a barmaid, although she never served in a bar in her life. She even recalls going out on the lake at Ismailia, south of Kantara, standing on a rubber ducky being towed by a motorboat. Somehow I find that a rather unbelievable image. On their days off, the women would hitchhike into Portside. For shopping, a nice cup of tea, a Hollywood movie, and perhaps dinner at one of the hotels that catered for European tastes. Whenever they had a weekend off, they might go to Cairo and stay at the Red Cross hostel. On a longer leave break, Margaret went down to Luxor to see Tutankhamun's tomb. To read her diaries, one gets the impression of a rather boring, extended holiday camp existence. While visiting Portside, Margaret experienced an air raid, one of a series that lasted about a week. With the power off at the hotel, the residents had to walk down several flights of stairs into an air raid shelter. Some shops were destroyed, but not the dry cleaners, which was fortunate as Margaret's coat was being cleaned and was not damaged. At Kantara, on the banks of the Suez Canal, the hospital was built close to the Kantara World War I cemetery. Here, Margaret found the grave of her uncle, Ernest Harold Mack, a lieutenant in the 8th Light Horse who was killed at the Battle of Magdala in December 1916. Ernie and his two brothers, who both survived the war, were in the second landing at Gallipoli in early May 1915, along with many of their former Geelong College school friends who were photographed there. But what about Margaret's sabotage work, I hear you ask? After the war, she would tell young physios about her exploits, how she would go out behind enemy lines at night with some of her army mates and assist with running wires for demolition of enemy supply chains. Well, sorry to break the bad news, but Margaret was no Nancy Wake. The hospital she worked at were far from the front line, and there was not a hint of guerrilla activity in her wartime letters and diaries, unless you believe that an entry "slept in till 11" indicated that she had had a long night of destruction. And, let's put it politely, Margaret was not really built for such nefarious activities. But she did have a wicked sense of humour. At the end of 1941, the United States came into the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 16th of February 1942, Margaret wrote in her diary, "Heard that Singapore had really fallen. Oh dear, what will it mean? Where will we end up? Bombay, Australia, Java?" The hospital was packed up to be sent to Java. They boarded an American transport ship, but only got as far as Suez. Fortunately for them, it was decided to send the hospital staff home to Australia instead. Margaret was sent first to the Children's Hospital in Frankston, south of Melbourne. This had been requisitioned by the Army and became the main orthopaedic hospital under Major John Cahoon, one of Melbourne's leading orthopaedic surgeons. Here she worked with patients who had undergone bone grafts. She described bone grafting as a form of careful carpentry, inlaying bone instead of wood. And now for a little self-indulgence. Here are parts of Margaret's diary entries for 1942 while at Frankston. Monday the 24th of August 1942, at 12:15 the doctor rang to say, "It's a boy," and both well. Next day, she recorded that apparently it's to be called Richard. It? After about 12 months at Frankston, the hospital was closed. Margaret and the patients were moved to new wards built at the Ballarat Psychiatric Hospital and later the Ballarat Convalescent Depot. Here she saw patients repatriated from New Guinea with terrible wounds which had become infected. Penicillin had just become available and saved many lives that would otherwise have been lost. Another 12 months, she was transferred to the Dawes Road Military Hospital in Adelaide and remained there until the end of the war. In May 1946, Margaret was discharged from the army. She was unsure whether to stay in Adelaide, return to her hometown of Melbourne, or go back to Launceston. She decided on the latter, as she was known there and had a position to return to. When she returned to LGH, it was to a new hospital complex, which had been completed while she was overseas and included dedicated children's wards. She came back just in time to witness the last wall of the old children's hospital in the foreground there being demolished. On her return, she and her mother boarded at the Labrina Guest House in Park Street. In 1951, this was purchased by the Girl Guides Association and is now a private residence. And she bought a new car, an Austin 8 Tourer. She had called her previous singer car Melba. I wonder if she thought her Austin 8 a little ostentatious. It was clear that Margaret intended to make Launceston her permanent home, so in 1947 she purchased a block of land in Penquite Road, Newstead. Here she had a house built for the princely sum of £1,679. She lived there until 2004, when the rigours of old age forced her into an aged care facility. The house has since been sold again. In May 1949, she was offered a position as locum for Helen Pride, who had a private practice and planned to go abroad. So Margaret left LGH and took over Helen's practice, located in Holyman House. She worked there for about 24 years and also made hospital and home visits. There was a lift in the building which eventually needed repairing, so Margaret was forced to move out for a week and operate from her home as a temporary measure. She decided to make this a permanent move and had a builder add an extra room as a consulting room. She remained there for the rest of her professional life. In June 1946, the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Physiotherapy Association was formed, and Margaret as its first Assistant Secretary. She went on to play an important administrative role in the APA and the World Confederation of Physical Therapy. She was a member of the APA Tasmanian Branch Executive until 1981 and President in 1978-79. And she was Australia's delegate to the World Confederation of Physical Therapy from 1959 to 1967, including Vice President in 1967. In September 1949, Margaret attended the inaugural meeting of the Seroptimus International Launceston branch and was elected to the committee. This was, and still is, an organisation of business and professional women endeavouring to bring higher standards into business, professional and community life and striving for world understanding and peace. This was a way in which Margaret could put into practice the principles she had developed since her childhood and through her wartime experiences. She held the position of club president in 1959-60 and again from 1975 to 1977, and was region president in 1977. Throughout her time, she served on many committees, and because of her efforts for St Giles, the club was awarded life membership of that organisation in 1985. In 1989, she received life membership of the club. She was the only inaugural member still active when the club celebrated its golden anniversary in 1999. In the mid-1950s, the development of a vaccine against polio meant that this dreaded disease eventually became a thing of the past, and Margaret was able to turn her attention more to general physio work. Margaret was on the board of St Giles for many years. In particular, she was a member of the admissions committee, helping to decide who should be admitted to the home. As a woman of action, she found the board meetings incredibly boring, but they gave her a chance to get on with her knitting. Throughout her professional life, she worked to ensure that a high standard of physiotherapy was provided not only at St Giles, but throughout northern Tasmania. In October 2007, St Giles honoured Margaret by naming its seating and equipment clinic the Margaret Mack Centre. This is a reflection of her skill and endurance and her commitment to the values of St Giles. The Margaret Mack Award was also instituted in 2007, a cash donation to support the work of the Post-Polio Network. This award continued until 2012, when Arthur Dobson, here today, relinquished his role and no one could be found to continue it. Margaret was well known to thousands of Tasmanian women. Some might even be in the audience here today, through her visits to the Queen Victoria Maternity Hospital and adjacent QV Tower, surely the ugliest building in Launceston, in High Street. Here she conducted postnatal exercise classes for 36 years. One former client recalled that she would round us new mums up to do our exercises after we gave birth. She was tough, but we loved her attitude and the funny things she would say to us. Her command was, "Exercises, girls!" As well as her St Giles and maternity work and her general practice, Margaret was also involved in geriatric physiotherapy, attending aged care homes such as Nazareth House in St Leonard's, now Mount Esk. Margaret travelled widely. The first trip that I'm aware of in 1951 took her to Kuala Lumpur, where she stayed with her brother Don, who was an engineer in the Malayan Railways, having returned after the war. Then she went on to England, where she worked in Cornwall and Edinburgh for several months. Then on to Sweden for the inaugural conference of the Crippled Children's Society in Stockholm. On her way back, she attended the International Seroptimus Conference at Harrogate in Yorkshire. As Australia's representative to the world's physiotherapy body, she attended several conferences in Europe. On one trip, she deviated via South America and visited Rio de Janeiro and Machu Picchu, in the company of her former wartime boss, Helen Todd. On another occasion in New York, she heard Dr. Jonas Salk talking about his development of the vaccine to counter the polio virus. She enjoyed attending conferences until she reached the age where she went to sleep in lectures and so gave up going to them. She twice travelled to Antarctica, the second time being when she was 76. This time, she found the effort of being pushed and pulled in and out of rubber duckies, zodiacs, signalled to her that her travelling days were probably over. Other trips included sailing down the Volga River in the former USSR, the Yangtze River in China, and the Amazon River in South America. She visited the Galapagos Islands, Brazil and Peru, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and safari parks in Kenya. She found the Middle East completely changed from her war years. Of particular interest were the places of ancient civilization. And of course, she saw much of Australia. Following each trip, she would show her slides to the many organisations interested in learning of her adventures. Whenever she visited our home in Melbourne, it was my job to set up the screen, load the slides and operate the projector in our lounge room. As she would keep her slides in an old corset box, this was deeply embarrassing for a gauche teenager. Margaret loved driving. From her first car, Melba, she took to the road with gusto. She joined the Light Car Club and competed in the women's section of the consistency test and the acceleration test at Patina Road, Longford. She was noted as showing great keenness, being the first woman member to compete. She even competed, one of only 2 women, in the 500-mile, 33-hour 1954 Alpine Rally. In spite of skidding her Morris Minor Series 2 off the road in deep snow near Watamana, she described the trip as lots of fun. She was once pulled over for speeding in David Street, Newstead. I suspect she was frequently pulled over for speeding. Fronting the magistrate, she told him, "Of course I was speeding. The brakes failed on the steep hill. How could you expect me to stay within the speed limit?" I can attest to her love of speed, having once tried to keep up with her on a family visit to Tasmania in 1987 while following her to her shack in Port Sorell. It was not a trip where the superb Tamar Valley scenery could be admired. In the 1984 Queen's Birthday Honours, Margaret was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for service to the welfare of people with disabilities. A further honour was received when she was awarded the Governor's, and there's a little quote from St Giles about how they well and truly understood the value of that. A further honour was received when she was awarded the Governor's Commendation in 1992. The citation reads, "For her long and devoted service to children with disabilities, I commend Miss Margaret Annette Rose Mack, OAM, for her professional contribution over more than 50 years to the community of Launceston in the field of physiotherapy, in particular her care for those afflicted with polio, and for her contribution and voluntary support for all aspects of the St Giles Society since its foundation in 1937, including service as a member of the Board of Management for over 35 years. But all good things have to come to an end sometime. And in July 1992, after a professional career spanning 55 years, Margaret finally took down the sign that for so many years had directed clients to her room at Penquite Road. But of course that was not entirely the end. Although retired, she continued to attend to a few long-term special patients who had become friends as much as professional clients. And she continued to play bridge both locally and in Hobart. She was a long-time member of the Launceston Bridge Club, still active at least until her mid-80s. She was on the committee for many years and president from 1984 until 1986. One of her bridge friends recalls that Margaret was missing her hearing aids one day because the cat had eaten them. Speaking of cats, when I first made contact with St Giles, the very first question I was asked was, "There's a story going around that Margaret used to give massage sessions to her cat. Is that true?" I was able to confirm the story, as I had witnessed the cat, Mr. Perkins, lying peacefully on the massage table while Margaret gave him a good thumping, front and back, while the cat purred with delight. She had a number of cats. I met Mr. Perkins, but there was also Percival. I'm sure if she'd had a female, it would have been called Penelope. While reading an Australian gardening book, my wife stumbled on a photo of a red-pink rhododendron named Margaret Mack. Could it be named after our Margaret Mack? I recalled a similar one at her home and found a photo of her home which I'd taken on one of my visits and which showed a large rhodo in the garden. Inquiries were made. Allen's nursery in Prospect recalled selling some to Margaret for Christmas presents many years ago. A Facebook request provided 37 replies, but none of which threw any more light on the matter. Eventually we discovered that it was bred by Bolter's nursery in Olinda, Victoria. But as they had been long out of business, we were not able to confirm the connection. But if it wasn't named after our Margaret, then who could it have been named after? Margaret was ambivalent about the changes that had occurred over the years to the role of the physio. She lamented that the younger generation didn't know how to give a good massage. Instead, they tended to supervise exercises undertaken by the patient and relied on fancy machines and magic potions to do the work of the masseur. On the other hand, she acknowledged that chest physio had gone ahead tremendously, and the modern treatment of hips and shoulders was not imagined a few years ago. And of course, the physio's basic role had not changed: to rehabilitate the patient after the surgeon has done his or her job. What is the key to being a good physiotherapist? Margaret was asked in 2003. Being able to listen, being able to encourage, being able to impart confidence, being pleasant under all circumstances. And of course, I think a sense of humour is a great help. It's always my wish when I see a little new baby, may you have a sense of humour. I think a sense of humour can take you through all sorts of things. It's much better to laugh than to be miserable, isn't it? But the end was near. She celebrated her 90th birthday in good cheer, but her health was deteriorating. Margaret died on the 19th of June 2005, aged 90. Her ashes were laid to rest at Carvella Cemetery in her adopted home of Launceston. Above the simple plaque is a yellow, flushed pink rose. We believe it's a hybrid tea peace rose, bred in France in the 1930s and given its present name on the day that Berlin fell in 1945. It was presented to each of the delegates at the inaugural meeting of the United Nations with a note reading, "We hope the peace rose will influence mankind's thoughts for everlasting world peace." What a fitting tribute for a woman who devoted her life through both war and peace to improving the lives of all those she encountered, both in her professional capacity and as a local, national and even international community member. But there was one final honour to be awarded. In 2011, Margaret was included in the Tasmanian Honour Roll of Women. This recognises the leadership provided by exceptional women. In Margaret's case, she was acknowledged for her service to the community and health. Her contributions to the profession of physiotherapy, to St Giles and to the Soroptimists International were specifically mentioned. So how should we remember Margaret? By her achievements. She was a practising physiotherapist from 1936 to 1992, 56 years. She was a physiotherapist in the Australian Army from 1940 to 1946, with 2 years of overseas service. She was an honoured member, and that's a specific title, of the Australian Physiotherapy Association. She was president of the APA Tasmanian branch. She was the Australian delegate to the World Confederation of Physical Therapists and its vice president. She was a charter member, president, life member of the Soroptimist Club of Launceston. She was a St Giles board member for 38 years, vice president and life governor emeritus. The Margaret Mack Seating and Equipment Centre at St Giles was named in her honour. She was president of the Launceston Bridge Club. She was awarded the Order of Australia Medal in 1984. She was awarded a Governor's Commendation in 1992. And she was placed on the Tasmanian Honour Roll of Women in 2011. But a person is more than a sum of their achievements. How might we describe Margaret? Well, people who've contacted me have used such terms as always happy, inclusive of everyone, warm, fun-loving, lovely disposition, passionate, a wicked sense of humour, caring and fun to be with, an impeccable memory, an exceptional physio, well-respected, legendary, a dynamo, a female icon, loyal, astute, modest, forthright. And one colleague described her as a psychotherapist as much as a physiotherapist. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions or comments. And I have a little flyer at the front desk you might have picked up, inviting people to contact me with more stories about Margaret, because I'd love to write a biography sometime when I have the time for it. So I've already heard one story today from the daughter of a soldier whom Margaret treated during the war in the Middle East. Any questions? Comments? No? Thank you.
We've had a request for all the physiotherapists here today to have a photo taken with Richard. So hands up if you... 1, 2, 3, 4, 5... Okay, so when we're finished, if you'd like to all gather in a corner somewhere and we can organise some photos. Yep, thank you. So thank you so much, Richard. That was wonderful. I didn't know Margaret Mack, but I certainly heard of her over the years, and that was an absolutely fascinating talk. And thank you so much. You've done all that in about a year. I know Richard wrote to me, perhaps about a year ago, and said, do you think we'd be interested in Margaret Mack? And I said, yes, certainly. So he's been working hard, and now this is the result of his work. So thank you so much. There's a little gift from us.
Thank you.
And thank you. So I think that's really all we need. All we need to do. But so thank you all so so much for coming today. We've had a good audience here and a great speaker. Thank you, Richard. And we'll see you all again, well, at the John West Lecture here in April and the AGM next year. So thank you very much.